For centuries, targeted colonization systematically stripped indigenous peoples of their lands and resources across the globe. This aggressive, structural erasure consumed territories and left a massive legal and physical vacuum in its wake. Because these communities were dispossessed of their physical borders and resources, they were explicitly blocked from exercising a basic human right, the ability to develop their own economies and societies according to their own needs and interests. In September of 2007, the international system formally acknowledged this history. Inside the United Nations General Assembly Hall, member states voted to adopt a sweeping resolution to address the resulting gap in international law. The declaration functions as a retroactive blueprint, codifying inherent rights into international law to replace the previous legal silence with a specific, enforceable framework. Since international law historically provided the legal cover to facilitate colonization, it must now serve as the exact mechanism to actively dismantle it. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, is therefore a structural necessity to correct the global record. The declaration is built on three main functional pillars. The first establishes the absolute right to a distinct cultural identity and physical existence. Article 8 of the text explicitly prohibits any forced assimilation or destruction of a group's culture. These protections guarantee the right to maintain and revitalize native languages, spiritual traditions, and oral histories, shielding them from outside interference or suppression. It places a mandatory requirement on individual states to provide effective mechanisms that prevent cultural deprivation from happening in the first place, and demands immediate redress when it does occur. Without explicitly binding protections for cultural identity, physical survival as a distinct people is impossible. Assimilation, in this context, is simply a sanitized form of structural erasure. The second structural pillar shifts focus from cultural survival to the physical necessity of territory and resources. It introduces a critical legal mechanism known as free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. This establishes an absolute prerequisite that must be met before any relocation or resource extraction can legally occur on traditional lands. Notice how this differs from standard corporate consultation. True consent means possessing the structural power to say no and definitively halt unwanted development. If traditional lands were confiscated without this rigorous consent, the declaration outlines strict legal requirements for restitution or equal, just compensation. Cultural identity and self-determination remain hollow concepts if a people possess no legal control over the physical land and resources required to actually sustain themselves. The third and final pillar completes this legal architecture by ensuring the absolute right to self-government and distinct political autonomy. This guarantees self-determination, giving indigenous populations the clear right to freely determine their own political status and shape their economic development independently of the host state. They have the right to maintain entirely distinct legal and political institutions, while also keeping the open option to participate fully in the broader political life of the nation if they choose to do so. This requires acknowledging indigenous decision-making procedures on their own terms, which often operate completely outside the bounds of traditional Western democratic structures. Autonomy requires recognized institutional power, the ability for a people to govern their own affairs on a sovereign footing, distinct from the host nation's regulatory framework. This official United Nations publication codifies these three distinct pillars into a finalized legal framework. Deep in the text, Article 43 explicitly defines exactly what this framework represents. It states that the rights recognized within it constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of the world. In international law, a minimum standard is a strict baseline. A popular misconception treats these protections as maximum aspirational goals to strive toward. They are strictly the floor, not the ceiling. Furthermore, the text ensures that none of the rights outlined here can be used to diminish or extinguish any existing treaties or rights indigenous peoples currently hold or may acquire down the line. UNDRIP does not represent the end of the struggle for indigenous autonomy. Rather, it is the mandatory, non-negotiable foundation upon which any just, post-colonial society must be built.